Our event is starting now, so please take your seats. Thank you very much for attending today. It is incredibly heartwarming to see so many people gathered here today on this momentous occasion. To introduce myself, my name is Lynne Hollander, and I am the president of the Berkeley Forum. Thank you. It is an honor to welcome all of you this evening to our 60 Years of Free Speech Movement panel. Now you can clap. Before we begin, as we do at all our speaker events, the Berkeley Forum would like to take this time to acknowledge that all our events, as well as the UC Berkeley campus, sit on the territory of the Ohlone people, and that we benefit from the occupation of this land. It is very important to us that we recognize this history out of the respect to the Mawikma Ohlone who are still present in Berkeley and the Bay Area today. So for more Native education resources on campus, we encourage you to look into the Centers for Educational Justice as well as community engagement. We also heavily want to emphasize that no recordings are allowed. This includes third-party live streaming and/or long-form video recording. And if you would like to watch this event is currently being live streamed and can be viewed on our YouTube channel at the Berkeley Forum both during and after the event. You can also find a high-quality recording of the event afterwards, probably 3 weeks after at the Berkeley Forum. So on behalf of the Berkeley Forum, we would like to give a sincere thank you to our partners. First of all, the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, UC Berkeley Public Service Center, the ASUC VP of External Affairs, and the Free Speech Movement Archives. Thank you so much for partnering with us for this event and contributing to our event outreach. And this event would not have been possible without all of your generous support. So now, with all that being said, I will pass the floor to our event manager for this evening, Nikki Iyer, to introduce our wonderful speakers and begin our panel this evening. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Nikki Iyer. I'm the event manager for this evening, and now more than ever, we think it's essential to discuss what free speech means at Berkeley. And we're honored to engage with the activists themselves that started this conversation 60 years ago. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers, Lynne Hollander Savio, Bettina Aptheker, and Jack Radey. Lynne Hollander Savio was deeply involved in the FSM. As a body at all of the rallies and sit-ins, and as co-editor of the near-legendary Robson Report, she held a non-voting seat on the executive committee. She went on to work on the movement in Mississippi, did publicity and fundraising for a variety of good causes, and worked as a clinical psychologist, ending her career as a children's librarian. In retirement, she was an actor in the Bay Area Community Theater Productions and with Stagewood Senior Theater. As the widow of Mario Savio, she served as the chairperson of the Mario Savio Memorial Lecture and Young Activist Award for 25 years. Thank you, Lynne. Bettina Aptheker is a distinguished professor emerita of feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz. She co-led the free speech movement, was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and co-led the National United Committee to Free Angela Davis. She taught her Introduction to Feminism's course for 30 years, and her feminism and social justice course has been taken by more than 120,000 people globally through the Coursera platform. She published her memoir in 2006, and her latest book, Communist in Closets, Queering the History, was released in 2022. Thank you, Bettina.
Yeah.
Jack Radey was the youngest elected member of the FSM Executive Committee, arrested in Sproul Hall at age 17. Jack was involved in activism against the Vietnam War and in anti-racism and trade union movements. He's worked in various professions as a warehouseman, machinist, journalist. He's worked in schools, in medicine, as a game designer and publisher, and as a documentary video production assistant. Now retired, he's an active military historian, a member of the Eugene Police Commission, a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and the current president of the FSM Archives. Thank you, Jack.
see. Or do we
What
not?
happens now?
I think we're ready.
Oh,
If you know it, join us.
Join us.
Ready?
From the tip of San Diego to the top of Berkeley's hills, we have built a mighty factory to impart our social skills. Social engineering triumph, managers of every kind. Let's know with drills and homework, manufacture human minds. Keep the students safe for knowledge, keep them loyal, keep them clean. This is why we have a college. Hail to IBM machine.
You know, Daniel pointed out the error in the long line, the last line, the IBM machine.
The song you just heard is from the FSM Christmas carols, which were sung originally during the movement. And the panelists throughout this talk will touch on the importance of music throughout FSM. Now, it is my honor, before we begin this panel, we want to offer you a brief history of what the FSM was. So I'm thrilled to introduce Robert Cohen, a professor of history and social studies at NYU. He has published 3 books on the free speech movement, and his biography on Mario Savio was selected as the common reading for Cal's On the Same Page program in 2014 that marked the FSM's 50th anniversary. As a Berkeley doctoral student, he helped organize the FSM's 20th anniversary, and he was a founder of Berkeley's TA and RI unions. This year, he is a senior fellow for the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and he recently published his latest book, Confronting Jim Crow. I'd now like to welcome Professor Cohen to offer the FSM overview.
Yeah!
Hey, Robbie.
I don't know how you follow that. I mean, it's a hard act to follow. First of all, I want to thank the Free Speech Movement veterans on this panel, Bettina Aptheker, Lynne Hollander Savio, and Jack Radey, and all the other FSM vets here and watching online for working so hard and sacrificing so much back in 1964 so the students and faculty on this campus could enjoy the right to freedom of speech. They were part of a student movement whose mass protests, exhilarating as they were, came at a price. Some FSM leaders endured suspension. Hundreds of FSMers who had nonviolently sat in at Sproul Hall were arrested, tried, and convicted under mass trial. Most had to pay fines, but some, including FSM leaders Mario Savio and Bettina, were sentenced to considerable jail time. 45 days for Bettina, 120 days for Mario for engaging in civil disobedience. Lynne was given a choice between 30 days or a fine, while Jack, who in 1964 was a juvenile, spent 4 weekends at Lake Chabot Juvenile Correction Center, followed by 6 months probation. In retrospect, it seems unjust, almost unbelievable, that anyone should be jailed or fined for championing free speech on this campus. On the meaning of the FSM's cause, free speech, here are the thoughts that famed FSM Mario Savio shared on FSM's 30th anniversary. Diogenes said, "The most beautiful thing in the world is the freedom of speech." And those words, Mario said, are in me. They're burned in my soul. Because for me, freedom of speech was not a tactic, not something to win for political advantage. To me, freedom of speech represents the very dignity of what a human being is. That's what marks us off from the stones and the stars. You can speak freely. It's almost impossible for me to describe. It's the thing that marks us as just below the angels. For many FSMers, the free speech issue at Berkeley connected deeply with what they saw as the most important moral struggle going on in America back then. The crusade led by Black Americans to end Jim Crowism, anti-Black racial discrimination. It was on Berkeley's small free speech streets area on that sidewalk strip of Bancroft and Telegraph, just outside the campus entrance, that the students picked up leaflets that led them to participate with scores of their classmates in their first Bay Area civil rights demonstrations, the largest of which was the big sit-in at the Sheraton Palace Hotel in March '64, a protest that pressured San Francisco's hotels and their racially discriminatory hiring practices. Some students from Berkeley and other campuses went from such local activism in the spring semester to the far more dangerous civil rights work in the climate-infested Deep South, as volunteers in the SNCC-led Black Voting Rights Crusade in Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. Very dangerous because almost a century of black disenfranchisement was being challenged, and that was a big threat to the white power structure in Mississippi. This crusade made headlines in summer of '64 when the tragic news broke that Freedom Summer volunteers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman had been murdered by white supremacists. So when students returned to Berkeley for the 1964 fall semester and learned that the UC administration had mandated the closure of Cal's free speech area on that sidewalk strip, many saw this as an immoral act of political censorship, an attack on the student wing of the civil rights movement. After all, the road that led students to the Sheraton Palace and Mississippi often began on that strip of sidewalk on Bancroft and Telegraph. Invested as it was with the moral weight of the black freedom struggle, Berkeley's free speech battle was one students felt deeply about from its beginning, because to keep faith with those who had put their lives on the line in Mississippi, they thought it urgent to preserve free speech at Cal, so other students could learn about and join the crusade against racism both in the South and here in the Bay Area. Mario Savio was a Freedom Summer volunteer, believed that many of his fellow Berkeley students, even if they had not gone south, were so sympathetic to that anti-racist crusade that they had vicariously gone to Mississippi. They and most of their classmates treasured Berkeley's free speech area with its political literature and activists staffing their organizations' card tables, recruiting for all kinds of causes. The students saw that political space as an important part of their education, giving them access to information on the latest causes from left to right, unavailable in most classes or in the unfree high schools from which many had graduated. A lot of high schools had restrictions on free speech back then. Some still do. The nobility of the free speech cause and its links to the black freedom struggle helped the FSM achieve a strong and growing popularity on campus. But the FSM proved deeply unpopular off campus. A January 1965 poll found that 74% of Californians disapproved of the free speech movement. 74%. This might seem surprising, but America has usually been a culturally conservative society that dislikes student movements, viewing the proper role of young people as deferring to their elders, obeying their rules, not questioning authority, and above all, not upsetting the status quo. Like many Americans who scoff that politically vocal athletes like LeBron James should shut up and play, much of the public in the FSM days thought students should shut up and study. Public opinion polls show that the majority of Americans also disapproved of the Southern black students' lunch counter sit-ins against Jim Crowism in 1960. The majority of Americans opposed the freedom rides and the student anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. The FSM's unpopularity was fanned and exploited by red-baiting newspaper columnists and by politicians and business leaders who spoke of the Berkeley riots, even though the FSM was a nonviolent movement. Perhaps the worst lie spread by the FSM detractors was that students were lawless rebels, simply out to cause trouble, and they had no valid grievances. Ronald Reagan, in his dishonest campaign speeches in his 1967 race to the governorship, which he ran by a landslide, generated wild applause on that campaign trail when he announced Berkeley's so-called free speech advocates, who in truth, he said, have no appreciation for freedom at all. The ringleaders of this assault on law and order should have been, in Reagan's words, taken by the scruff of the neck and thrown out of the university once and for all. And Reagan's violent rhetoric would only escalate during his term as governor, when in 1970 he said of beating back the student movement, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement. UC President Clark Kerr, unlike the right-wing Reagan, was an establishment liberal and in many respects a democratic educational leader who was interested in democratic access to education. But nonetheless, Kerr shared Reagan's view that the FSM was not an admirable free speech crusade. Free speech, Clark Kerr claimed, was a phony slogan. And according to President Kerr, UC had allowed, quote, full free speech prior to the FSM's emergence. Echoed for decades by the FSM's detractors, this claim appeared just a few weeks ago in a Wall Street Journal op-ed denouncing the FSM on its 60th anniversary. All you need is a glance at the political geography of Berkeley in 1964 to see that these claims about free speech being a phony issue are false. Cal had a major free speech problem long before it closed down the free speech area on the Bancroft Strip that September. Note that this free speech area was not on campus, but off, just outside the campus entrance. So one had to go beyond the jurisdiction of the repressive UC administration to enjoy the First Amendment right to engage in political advocacy. This has been the case at Cal since 1934. Back then, amidst a Bay Area Red Scare sparked by the San Francisco General Strike and the West Coast Waterfront Strike, the UC administration banned political activism on campus, pushing it outside the campus. So Cal's free speech area in the 30s and 40s was just beyond Seder Gate. And that tradition of having free speech only right off the campus was in fact known as the Seder Gate tradition. In the late 50s, when the campus expanded, the free speech area moved to the Bancroft Strip, so it would remain off campus. This meant that for decades, until the free speech movement came along, there was more free speech off campus than on, which doesn't speak well of the state of free speech at Berkeley prior to the FSM. Some of Cal's free speech violations in these earlier years occurred covertly. The Sproul administration worked with Northern California district attorneys and police to assemble an intelligence network monitoring leftist Berkeley students in the Depression decade. During the Cold War era, UC administrators secretly sought to blacklist radical students, including the late Leon Litwack, my future Cal professor and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, seeking to bar him from being admitted as a student to the teacher education program at Cal because of his leftist politics. But UC most grievously eroded free speech and academic freedom during a second Red Scare wrought by the Cold War, imposing on its employees an anti-communist loyalty oath more appropriate to a police state than to a great university, leading to the firing of more than 2,000 faculty, the largest purge of dissenting faculty in Cold War America. Cal was a campus that for decades banned communists from speaking on campus, including Steve's father, speaking of the history department, had to go off campus. And in 1959, President Kerr imposed these Kerr directives that even barred the student government from taking positions on off-campus political issues. And that led to what student activists called sandbox politics. Given this grim history, it's not surprising that UC's administration caved when in 1964, a turbulent presidential election year, Bay Area business leaders, state legislators, and right-wing newspapers pressured UC to clamp down on the student protesters. The Berkeley students sit at racially discriminatory hotels and employers in the spring of '64. They're picketing of the Republican convention in the summer of '64, and other civil rights pickets, and infuriated these powerful interests. And some of Cal's own administrators were furious about it too. When an Oakland Tribune reporter discovered that the plaques embedded in the sidewalk on Bank and Telegraph indicated that part of that strip was on campus property, the administration in mid-September '64 jumped at the chance to ban political advocacy there, shutting down the free speech area that was treasured by Berkeley students. The free speech area's closure ignited student protest via a united front composed of student organizations from left to right. First came polite negotiations with the dean. Then it was clear she lacked the power to restore the free speech area. Students defied the ban, setting up their political advocacy tables on Sproul Plaza. When the administration escalated by citing for disciplinary action the first students who staffed those tables, hundreds of students signed a petition of complicity, saying that they too had violated the ban and staffed those tables. On September 30th, this student solidarity continued as hundreds of students showed up at the dean's office with the cited students, demanding that the dean meet with them all, not just with those few students who had been cited for disciplinary action. When the dean refused to meet with them all, the first Berkeley sit-in began and lasted late into the night. This was when Mario Savio emerged as the movement's peace spokesperson, debating the deans, refuting their claims that UC was politically neutral, indicting the free speech ban, and the undemocratic mode of decision-making that had yielded such repression. Witnessing Savio's speech and the dean's inability to convincingly defend their position after Mario critiqued it, David Lance Cohen concluded, "Had I been in the shoes of the administration, I would have trembled at this oratory and carefully examined my motives and what I hoped to gain and what I stood to lose. This is not the speech of fractious, willful children deprived of a glittering toy. This is a speech of Americans who dressed up in war paint and threw tax tea at the Boston Harbor." The next day, Busey's administration, following a divide and conquer strategy, enacted its plan to arrest a non-student who violated the ban. So at noon on October 1st, 1964, as thousands of students poured out the Sproul, coming out of their classes heading for lunch, they saw a Congress of Racial Equality activist, Jack Weinberg, a former math graduate student, being arrested for violating the free speech ban. As a veteran civil rights organizer, Jack went limp, slowing down his arrest as police dragged him into their squad car in Sproul Plaza. In those moments, someone, we don't know exactly who, or a lot of people claim it was them, shouted, "Sit down!" And the first dozens and then hundreds of students sat down, forming a nonviolent blockade around the car. Mario Savio removed his shoes, climbed up and stood atop the car, using it as a platform to explain the protest to the growing crowd of curious students. This began a 32-hour car top rally where speaker after speaker, women, including Bettina, and men from the roof of that blockaded police car denounced the restrictions on free speech, probed the meaning of freedom, its importance for a university, and discussed ways to win free speech for a university. Reflecting back on that moment, when he first climbed atop the police car, Mario explained, "When I do something I feel is a little bit questionable, a little bit risky," getting atop the police car is a little bit risky, "my heart beats faster. I wouldn't have been surprised if people had hooted me down. I had some feelings of embarrassment. I took my shoes off. I didn't want to hurt the car, but it had a kind of poetic rightness to it. Sometimes you're just gripped by the moment and you have a feel for what's poetically right. What was correct? Free speech or police taking away this person who was sitting at a political advocacy table? It was a question of what thing would prevail. What deserved contempt and what deserved praise? You sometimes feel those things. Summarizing those 32 hours, when one idealistic free speech advocate after another spoke from atop the blockaded car, historian Rick Perlstein wrote, "Boston Harbor, Harper's Ferry, Omaha Beach. This time the stand for freedom would be made from atop a dented police car's roof." The blockade and car top rally generated headlines and paved the way for a semester of nonviolent protest, mass organizing, negotiations, civil disobedience, a TA strike, and administration overreach that in December culminated in the FSM winning over the faculty, sealing the movement's free speech victory. That's 1 cent summary. And this victory came on December 8, 1964, when the faculty overwhelmingly voted for the December 8th resolution that the university should stop regulating the content of speech on campus. And I just want to end by saying that this protest, that rally, very symbolic of both the FSM and all the freedom movements of the 60s. Think about it. The protesters atop the police car, liberty over order. That's what that symbolized. And as historian Carl Shorsky explained, and by the way, that's also why Reagan and conservatives were so upset about it. As Carl Shorsky, the historian, explained, those whose basic concern was with order were always favored over those primarily concerned with freedom. It was much like the civil rights movement, where protest marches and citizens were illegal, but fundamental to the realization of new freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. And with that said, I'd like to now pass it over to our student moderator for the evening, Emma Teng.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emma. I'm a senior at Berkeley studying biology, undergraduate, part of the Berkeley Forum. Bettina, Jack, Lynne, thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's really a pleasure to have you here at the forum. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that we'll have an audience Q&A at the end of the event, so if you think of a question for our speakers, please save it for them. I'd like to start off the conversation with some introductions. So starting with Jack, could you all give a brief overview of your role in the free speech movement and who you were from a personal perspective?
I was a 17-year-old freshman out of Merced High School. I came up to Cal by accident. I applied to a number of colleges because my family expected me to go to college after high school and been turned down by many, but I was accepted by Cal because I had pretty good grades. And I was thinking maybe I'd go to Kitsap Junior College until I was picked up hitchhiking going up to Seattle that summer, and the guy said, "What are you going to do, kid?" And I told him, I had 2 colleges I might go to, and he said, "Go to Cal. Whatever you're interested in, there'll be a lot of people there who will be interested in it, and that won't be true in Kitsap." So I came up and got involved, and I found everything that I wanted as soon as the first picket line went up. That was what I was here for. And so during the free speech movement, I just worked. Lee Felsenstein has said there were 3 groups of us. The Apollinarians, who gave speeches, talked about philosophy, the Dionysians, who partied, and the Hephaestians. And the Hephaestians, I work, therefore I am. If there's something to be done, I'll do it. And we have a whole row of them sitting right there. That's who I was.
So that's marvelous. The first thing I wanted to say, very formally on behalf of the 3 of us and Robbie and the whole Free Speech Movement Archive board, is to formally thank the Berkeley Forum for putting this together. And Nikki and everyone who's been involved, I want to say that it's been an inspiration for us, and we are so grateful. So thank you. Thank you very much. So my very brief opening was, I was born and raised in a communist family. My mother was a union organizer, and my father was a prominent historian of African American history and described by the New York Times as the Communist Party's Marxist theoretician. So I was born in '44, and World War II was not yet over. So we were in the shadow of that war and the Holocaust. And so I was steeped in anti-fascist, anti-war, civil rights politics from a very, very, very young age. And I went on the first March on Washington for Civil Rights that was organized in the summer of 1957, primarily by the NAACP in response to the awful lynching of Emmett Till that had happened in 1955, for those of you that know about that terrible lynching of Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955. And they organized the first March on Washington in '57. I was 13. Went by myself on a bus. I arrived in Berkeley at 18 in 1962, thinking I would be a pre-med major. It didn't work out because I was so involved in politics and I couldn't study properly to be a pre-med major. I had already joined the Communist Party, and I was a member of a socialist student youth organization called the W.E.B. Du Bois Clubs, named after Dr. Du Bois. And my job with the Du Bois Club was to set up our table. So that's what I did, and that's why I got cited by the deans. I just sort of wandered, literally, I wandered into this. And then, so I became part of that protest and all of the things that Robbie has already described. And and I was, of course, I sat down around the police car, just as that has been described. And my first speech was from the top of a police car because Mario and Art Goldberg told me to get up there and say something. So I got up there, I took my shoes off like they did, and I went up there, And I don't remember everything I said, but it was at night, and the television lights were in my eyes, so I couldn't really see the audience. But I remember that I quoted Frederick Douglass, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And then there was this roar from the students in front of me, and my whole body just went like that, and I was hooked. I really wanted free speech. And so then I just wanted to say that, that the settlement, there was in negotiations, and we let the police car go, and Jack was arrested, but charges were not pressed and so forth. Anyway, after that weekend, during that weekend, while we were organizing what became the free speech movement, Clark Kerr announced that 49% of the demonstrators were communists. And so that was in the San Francisco Examiner, it was a front page headline. And I remember being at the meeting, and I remember Mario slapping his knee with glee and saying, "I know, Bettina's going to speak at the next rally on Monday, and we'll throw the real communists at him." That's who I was then. I was 20.
I was a transfer student from the East, and I was in my final semester as an English major. I was a pink diaper baby. Does anybody need that explained? I was born just before the war. My parents had been members of the Young People's Socialist League, YPSL, and their friends were still old lefties. And despite their inactivity, they still maintained their interest in the news and politics. Their perspective was roughly that of Bernie Sanders, give or take a few issues. I absorbed their vision and their ideas at the dinner table, but I had an aversion to the ideological politics of the late 50s. And I stayed almost totally away from any causes or political groups. But in February 1960, 4 black college students were attacked when they sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And like thousands of other students, their dignity, who were captivated by their dignity and courage and moved, I experienced that same thing. At my college, we raised bail money and picketed the local Woolworths in support of their struggle. And when I transferred to Cal, I followed the news of both the national and local civil rights movements, but I felt too overloaded with schoolwork to do more than participate occasionally. I couldn't join Freedom Summer because I had to work, but I was gripped by the long, fruitless search for the 3 missing civil rights workers, and when their corpses were discovered, with James Chaney's having been badly beaten, I felt grief and also what I can only call survivor's guilt. Mario had actually been to Mississippi, but as Robbie pointed out, many of us had been there vicariously. So when the battle for the Bancroft Strip began, I was very ready to be involved. When the table sitters were cited, I signed the statement of complicity, and with about 300 other people, kept their appointment to see the dean. The next day, I watched Jack Weinberg, as we had planned, refuse to identify himself, go limp, and be put in a campus police car. When the spontaneous call to sit down rang out, without hesitation, I sat, and I stayed. Which led to my spending the rest of the semester as one of the FSM troops, one of those needed bodies, and also serving as editorial coordinator of a large crew of student researchers for what became known as the Rossman Report, an almost legendary anthology of documents formerly entitled administrative pressures and student political activity at the University of California. Conceived by Michael Rossman and informally known with his name, it exploded the myth of UC as a free speech haven. And I would say more about it, but I've run out of time.
Thank you guys so much for your introduction. I think something that's apparent in all of your introductions is that this history is not just a collection of facts, it's really your personal life and your thought process and your ethics, and it's something that has followed you throughout life. And so with that in mind, we wanted to ask you about the movement itself and moments that you felt were crucial. So first question will be directed towards Lynne. And the free speech movement is an event that spanned 2 semesters, requiring members to negotiate university policy, settle internal conflicts, organize events, and navigate arrests. What, in your opinion, do you feel was the most pivotal moment of the FSM?
Well, I think actually there were 3 pivotal moments. The first one, and the most important, was the sit-in around the car, because that turned us from a small group of protesters and picketers into a mass movement. And it got people excited, it got people committed, it got people energized and working in whatever way they could. And so that's the central event. But there were others, and the 2 that really spring to mind, because like the car sit-in, they are examples of how the administration, when we were down lowest, when we thought all is lost, the administration would do an inconceivably stupid thing from their own point of view. I mean, who brings a police car onto the middle of the campus at the noon hour with thousands of students around? The other 2 events were when when we had sort of lost on the issue of being punished by the university with the camp if we did something illegal. If you advocated something illegal on campus, even if it wasn't illegal what you advocated, if it turned out that the demonstration people got arrested, and then you could be punished by the university, disciplined, for having advocated a legal action that resulted in an illegal behavior. So it was a kind of a hard concept to explain to masses of students. And a lot of people felt that you have achieved so much. You've gotten the right to recruit members, to advocate, to collect money. Let's stop. We don't need to do this. And it looked like we had a sit-in with a couple of hundred students, and finally split up and decided not to get arrested. We left, but it was a disaster. What did the administration do at this moment? They send out letters over the vacation punishing 8 students for actions that had taken place 2 months before, that we had thought had been settled by everything that had happened since that time. So we were furious, and we went on with this principle that it's all of us or none, you know. We all did this, so cite everybody. And that's what triggered the FSM, the Sproul Hall sit-in. But there was one more place where we could lose, and that was when Clark Kerr talked with Robert Scalapino, the chair of the political science department, and got all the department chairs, the most conservative faculty group on campus, and they came to a decision that would settle the matter. I don't even remember what the terms of their decision was, but we were all invited to enter the Greeks Theater. They're all seated on the chair. Kerr gets up and Scalapino gets up and gives the way that the department chairs have decided to settle this issue. And Kerr dismisses the meeting. And as planned, Bettina encourages Mario to go ahead, and he walks slowly down the aisle and steps onto the podium. The meeting has been adjourned now, and immediately before he opens his mouth, he's grabbed by campus cops around his neck and pushed to the ground. And, before 20,000 students, there was an uproar. It was like, the minute it happened, Clark Kerr said, "We've lost." He knew, and so I think any of those three moments could have gone a different way, and we were lucky. They were stupid, we were lucky.
I think especially it's worth emphasizing the initial police car sit-in, because that was the point. Like, I had been the lone weirdo in each high school I'd been in. I'd been in 4 different ones. I made trouble, but nobody else did. And I came up to Cal, and I didn't know anybody or anything. And the United Front, it was called then, had started in protesting these restrictions, but it still seemed a relatively small amount of people until that police car came out there, and people sat down around it, and more, and suddenly, I wasn't the only weirdo making trouble. There was hundreds and thousands of us, and all of us saw that. And all the people sitting down there were not the politicals. It was everyone who had been watching the civil rights movement grow during their whole time growing up and feeling as American citizens, it's our responsibility to do something to support the Constitution and democracy and rights. I mean, that's what we're taught as kids, We're supposed to be American patriots. And you don't just do that by saying it, you do it by doing it, and at your own risk if necessary. The people behind the wall at Lexington and Concord were not organized or sent out there by anybody. They knew it needed to be done and did it, and we did the same thing. But that was the moment we realized we're not alone. Why, there's thousands of us. We can actually do this, and we knew how to do it.
Right. I just want to add one other I think crucial moment, and Lynn is absolutely right about Mario wanted to rush the stage, and I said to him, don't run, because I was afraid they'd tackle him if he ran. Of course, they tackled him and he didn't run, so what do I know? But the thing I wanted to say was that moment on the stage shifted the dynamic in the faculty. And so December 8th, which was the next day, the more radical faculty who had been organizing were able to talk to their colleagues in a different way, and they presented the resolution before the academic senate, which has already, I think Robbie talked about it. And I wanted to just describe for a moment the scene. There were thousands of us outside Wheeler Auditorium, and the faculty was inside, and they were speaking. And it was for or against a resolution supporting the demands of the free speech movement. And they spoke with extraordinary eloquence. It was extraordinary eloquence. Of course, there was some that opposed, but you could tell from the tenor of the comments and the things that were being said that there was a passion in the support. And then the vote came, and we were outside, and they had been broadcasting the speeches to us. There were microphones set up. You know that old oak tree was glistening in the moonlight, and we were quiet. And they announced the vote. It was Scalapino as the chair of the Senate. He said 824 in favor and 115 opposed. That's a tremendous majority. And then the faculty filed out of Wheeler, and we parted and made an aisle for them and started applauding in unison. And I will tell you, they were almost all white, and they were all male, except there was one woman professor, Anna Pitkin, in political science. And many of those old men were weeping. And I think they were weeping because at that moment they knew that the McCarthy terror had been killed.
I should add, as those of you who were there remember, we were all weeping too.
Yes, we were. This is true.
And you know, I get misty-eyed now thinking about it.
Professor Denbrook, the blind professor of rhetoric, who had led the fight, been our strongest ally from the beginning. He came out and he picked up his cane and he waved it over his head like that, and we went absolutely crazy. It was wonderful.
Thank you guys so much for your responses. It's really moving to hear your anecdotes. But we've talked a lot about the past, but a lot of the free speech movement and the tactics and techniques that were used then are still very applicable today to student activists. And some key characteristics of the free speech movement include, as you guys talked about, non-violence, but non-compliant enough to be arrested, and also a participatory democracy where there's no one main leader, but and so how are these kinds of tactics and techniques still applicable to students today? And we can start with Jack.
There were a number of things that made it work for us. And one was I noticed that there's patterns in fashions in student or other general activism. We got our education from watching the civil rights movement and understood, nonviolence was understood not just by the hardcore activists, but everybody knew what it was about. We never had to enforce a discipline. Everybody knew. One person, one activist, tried to agitate people to attack the police and free Jack from the car. And when the police arrested him and took him away, people in our crowd applauded the police, okay? Because we understood, no, we don't want to get in fights. We're nonviolent, and we stick with that. We don't think we're going to win by the force of our macho. We don't think we're going to win by the force of our righteousness. You know, we are right. There may not be many of us, but we're right anyway, so we don't need to talk to anybody else. You know, if you aren't on our side, it's because you're no good, you know. And so all we need to do is denounce you, and we'll just go ahead with our action. We didn't do that. Partly because we had to be a coalition. We represented the interests of the entire spectrum on campus and of all students, really. It was our rights being taken away. We had to stay democratic. We had to stay fairly open, and we had to win the support of the entire campus community, and that was never exactly stated. This thing seems to be cutting in and out. But we all knew it was what we had to do, that we would win by convincing people. So even when we went in for our big climax sit-in, where it was so important to get as many people as possible inside, from our platform, on our microphone, we had the president of the ASUC, who was opposed to us, give a speech against the sit-in, because we believed we were not going to tell people this is what you have to do. We were going to make our case. We want to convince you. And there are other arguments against us. But we think our arguments are good, so you will agree with us. But you can hear the others, and we'll tell you what they are. What else? We also listened, which was real important. The free speech movement had its executive committee made up of representatives of all the groups. And each one of those went back to their groups and heard what the groups had to say. And each one of us lived in a living unit somewhere and went to classes and were part of, and we talked to everybody. Everybody talked about this every day during the entire free speech movement. And we listened. We heard when people said, okay, that's what you're planning next week? I don't think that's right. You know, you're going off, flying off the handle. You guys need to slow down a bit, because I'm not convinced that's the right thing to do. And we could bring this back to the executive committee, who could pass it on to steering committee, so we didn't get out of touch. We didn't just listen to our own voices. Finally, last item, we reached out all over the place for allies, to the religious community, to the labor movement, to the political parties, including the Republicans. We didn't have a plug there, but we reached. And we made, internationally, all over the place, we solicited support and got them to pressure against the university, so that we had the massive amount of force built up. And when they made their misstep, we had the power to smash them and win. We never lost track of the point that what we were trying to do was win our goal. Not just be right and go down fighting, but to win. And we did it.
I think I'll just pick up on a couple of points. I agree with everything. I mean, we're all on the same page here about how we organized and the ways in which we try to practice a democratic movement and also a nonviolent movement. What I wanted to say was the victory of the free speech movement enabled the anti-war movement in the United States. The first teach-in, and so there was a cascading effect. Once the regents passed a resolution December 14th that said that henceforth their regulations would not go beyond the First and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. And that guaranteed that there would be the same freedom of speech on campus as there was off campus, which was the principle that we were fighting for. Now, once that happened, there was a cascade of similar actions by administrators and boards of trustees and so forth all over the country. And I can tell you this because Mario and I and others went on tour after the free speech movement in December. ABC paid for our way, and then we stopped wherever we could across the country. And we didn't have to say a word. We came onto the stage, and there were thousands of people, students in the audiences, and they cheered us. They just were cheering because there was this momentum, there was this feeling of the victory of what it represented. So the first teach-ins against the war in Vietnam were held at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And you may remember that one was held here in May of 1965. It opened the door to educating the students, all of us, about what was happening in Vietnam and where it was even, and why there was a war and the US complicity in it and so on. And that kind of thing is what the sort of the momentum that the free speech movement built, all the way to the Paris in '68, when the students almost overthrew the de Gaulle government, and to Prague, also in the spring of 1968, the pro-democracy movement. They were all infused in various ways, encouraged in various ways. So I just wanted to point that out. And of course, there's movements happening now, which we can talk about, but I'm just referring to those things that happened in the immediate aftermath of the free speech movement, of what it enabled. And the other thing it enabled, that's because it guaranteed freedom of speech, was the establishment of Third World College here at Berkeley, and the establishment of an ethnic studies at San Francisco State. And that was a crucial change that then brought about a whole cascade again of changes in the compositions of the student body and the faculty for the first time. So it had this kind of effect that was very positive, I think, overall.
Yeah, I just want to add. Go ahead. I wanted to add one more thing about leadership. because I think that was an extremely important aspect that made the FSM a very successful movement. And we believed in structure, and we believed in leadership, and we believed in participatory democracy. And leadership and participatory democracy were not contradictory. And so we had a big structure. We had an executive committee which was pretty representative of the political groups. I don't know how much people went back to their organizations and got advice and consulted with them and stuff, but that was the theory in any way. And then we had a steering committee that was, had to report to the executive committee, and their actions about decisions, their day-to-day decisions, had to be okayed by the executive committee. And then, in the end, people voted with their feet. You had to receive the okay of the masses, because if you didn't, they weren't going to show up. They weren't going to picket or do what you wanted them to do. So it was extremely democratic, and for the most part, I would say, there were moments when, things slipped through. But when we looked at a movement like Occupy, which in some ways was just mind-blowing for the country and had a tremendous effect. But if you have, you've got to have everybody who wants to talks for how long they want to talk, forever, and there's nobody's taking any responsibility for anything. So you have to have some kind of structure and leadership thing when you do a movement if you want it to be successful. At least that's my opinion.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your answers. I have a question for Bettina. In your answer to the last question, you mentioned how the free speech movement has had a legacy and still has a legacy, where it led to the anti-Vietnam War protests and also formation of the ethnic studies departments at Berkeley and elsewhere. And it's still having an impact on Berkeley as a school where student activism is a very strong aspect of the community. In the past year, college campuses have seen an influx of protests and encampments in response to the mass displacement and killing of civilians in Palestine. Considering recent UC-wide policy on restrictions of time, place, and manner, what, if at all, do you think students should demand from the university in terms of their free speech rights?
Okay. Well, yes, so there have been, there have been these mass encampments. They have been nonviolent. I want to emphasize that. They have not instigated violence, and they have, I think you're familiar with the encampments. There was one here at Berkeley. There was one at UC Santa Cruz, where I work. There was one at NYU, Columbia, Dartmouth. So I can name a whole slew of campuses across the country, University of Oregon. And UCLA, yes, and UC Irvine, and others of the UC. So what I want to say about it is, there's a number of things that can be said. But first of all, the horror of the deaths that have taken place. First, I acknowledge the deaths of the people in Israel on October 7th. I think that's important to acknowledge. And the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian people that's been going on for decades. And so you have this terrible situation, awful violence, and of course the deaths now of over 40,000, I think it's up to 45,000 Palestinians, and now the bombing in Lebanon. Now the encampments took place before the current the current bombings in Lebanon, so I'll just leave that. I'm just stating that that's going on. A lot of the students that were involved in the encampments were Jewish. That's one thing I want to emphasize. They were not all, so a lot of the Jewish students were involved in protests. The Jewish community is divided. I think that's an important thing to point out. There's not unanimity, but there are very wealthy Jewish people in this country who are very conservative and very pro-Israel, who have pressured administrations, and I feel, personally, as a Jew, unconscionable ways to prevent them from allowing the students to conduct what are peaceful protests and forms of encampment. That's the first thing I would emphasize. Then I think the other thing is that here at Berkeley, your chancellor, the chancellor here at Berkeley, was a model of free speech in that she did not try to use the police to close down the encampment. In fact, she negotiated with the students. She was a very strong supporter of the concepts of the free speech movement and successfully negotiated a settlement which included investigating the university's complicity in funding military support for Israel. And that's what the students were after. And I really admire her for that. When she was doing that, the regent said to her, "You use the police or we're going to fire you." And she reminded them that she was already announced her retirement. So go ahead, you know. So she called their bluff, so to speak. On the other hand, in campuses like at UCLA, they allowed anti-encampment protesters to come in and commit terrible violence against those who were in the encampment. And the police did nothing for more than, I think, a couple of hours before they intervened, and then they ended up arresting the people that were part of the encampment. That was really outrageous. So I could go on with things, but I also wanted to point out one other thing. So at NYU, which I know something about because I'm good friends with Robbie, and he was very involved in speaking about free speech issues while the encampment was going on at NYU. The students set up, it was a completely nonviolent, it was an encampment, and the first thing they did, because of the dates of when the encampment started, the Jewish students organized a Seder. And then they used the Seder as an occasion for discussion among all the students who were there, whatever their religious or non-religious affiliation, to talk about issues of freedom and liberation. And the same thing happened at Columbia. They also did a Seder. So the point, I think you can see the point I'm trying to make is I think the students were admirable in what they were trying to do. And I think the last thing, in the interest of time, I mean, I could go on, I want to point out that the former head of Jewish studies at Dartmouth, who is a professor of labor studies, went out, she's 60 years old, Annalise Orlick is her name, she went out to observe the beginning of what was going to be an encampment, and the police grabbed her cell phone, knocked her to the ground, she stood up, grabbed her cell phone back, they knocked her down again, she got up again, they knocked her down again, and then they arrested her. And at Dartmouth, they didn't even allow the encampment to get started. That's not the United States. That should not have been allowed here. And I greatly admire, but my point is she was Jewish. She was a Jewish professor who had headed Jewish studies at Dartmouth. So any idea that the encampments are inherently anti-Semitic or something like that, that's not true. They're not. All right. Then, and I think it's important to say that there may be some anti-Semitic slogans, yes, but the heart of these protests are not anti-Semitic. And finally, I want to say shame on President Drake for his new regulations that time, place, and manner kill freedom. He has time, place, and mannered freedom of speech to death. And I think that it's very, very unfortunate that he has done this and caved to a certain kind of pressure. Thank you.
grandpa telling the kids to get off the lawn, but I have a little problem with encampments. I said before that protests tend to follow fashions, and you know the statement about generals learning how to win the last war, but never ready for the next one. We were trained by the civil rights movement, by observing it, you know, and learned tactics and the techniques. And after a while, we got so confident in our numbers, we thought our sheer macho would go out and win the fight in the street with the cops. And during the Vietnam War, we got considerably less nonviolent. And this was in all number of theaters of combat, politics. And then it got worse when people saw the black bloc stuff in Europe and thought that's what you know, this is a demonstration. You put on a mask and you go get your, you know, bottles to throw and we'll go down there and have a demonstration. Because that's how they're done, right? And then after Occupy Wall Street, when people think, okay, we're going to have a protest, get your tents. Where do we go? And I find a problem with encampments. When we occupied Sproul Hall, we had intention to hold it for 3 days, no more. That was when the Academic Senate was going to meet. We were going to walk out and walk to them. We were not planning to hold Sproul Hall to the death. With an encampment, and with Occupy Wall Street particularly, it seemed that a win would happen when Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein walked down to Zuccotti Park and handed over the keys and the code to the computer and said, okay, you win, you know, we're done. And that wasn't going to happen. So you were holding until when? And an encampment requires people to stay there 24 hours a day. Most people can't do that. It selects out. It separates you from those others who are not encamping. If you have a whole system of hand signals that you have to learn and new words for everything, it limits the number of people who can be involved. Once you have an encampment, you suddenly have new requirements. Instead of reaching out to the people out there that you need to convince, you are reaching in to figure out how to govern the encampment, how to have curfews, how to provide the food, how to do the security, how to do, and you're not doing your basic purpose, which is outreach to the people you want to convince to make your demonstration bigger. You're certainly not doing that at 2 in the morning when you're sleeping in your tent. You can be sleeping at home comfortably, come back the next day, and be there in the same spot, better rested. And so all I'm calling for is not an end to encampments, nor condemning them because they are courageous, they are effective in spotlighting an issue, but they need to be rethought, I believe, and more creativity and tactics, which I know you folks can come up with, I highly recommend. And stay off the damn lawn.
Thank you guys for your responses. I have another question directed towards any of you guys that would like to answer. In addition to the more protests this past year, there have been other protests at Berkeley, namely in 2017, when there was a series of right-wing speakers that came to Berkeley, including Milo Yiannopoulos. They attempted to speak, and in response to Yiannopoulos' often racist and hateful views, Berkeley protesters caused $100,000 of damages to campus property and also eventually forced an event cancellation. So my question to you is, do all views have a place in universities? And how do we reconcile upholding free speech with safety, whether physical or mental?
I have some thoughts. I have some thoughts on this, but I don't have the real solution. Do all views have validity? I think that attacking individuals by name or by racial groups or by religious groups or whatever is illegitimate. It's not a discussion of ideas or of politics or anything. It's just insulting in order to try and enrage. But I also feel that destroying useful tactic or a valid tactic. And I was not in favor during the Vietnam War of the people who burst into classrooms and interrupted the lecture, you know, to give us a screed against the war, because there were classes going on. There may be moments when it is, you know, necessary to do something like that, but on the whole, I think those are illegitimate tactics. And doing things where you're trying to win by being by being violent, by overwhelming them with your force, is crazy, because they always have more force than you. You know, you can never beat them, and it's like the world is, do we destroy each other by who can exert the most physical power over each other? And I don't think it's the way that left-wing political movements should behave, just as I don't think it's the way that US or Israel or Germany or whatever should behave. You've got to be trying to reach people on a higher level than I'm bigger than you and my daddy's bigger than you and we can beat you up. Anyway, that's...
I just wanted to, in response to this question, point out that in May of 1965, members of the American Nazi Party picketed this campus at the entrance with signs that denouncing the free speech movement, and in particular a sign that said, "Burn Aptheker." I don't know how many of you remember that, but it's rather sharp in my memory. And when I went to inquire about this from various authorities, I was told that the speech was protected because it did not present a clear and present danger to my safety. Now, I think that was true. In other words, no one, certainly in this environment, was going to attack me in that moment. I had many death threats and all kinds of things over the years, but you understand what I'm saying? The Justice Holmes decision on freedom of speech is you curtail or you can stop freedom of speech if it presents a clear and present danger. So now to the speeches of Yvalisse and other right-wing people, does their speech present, is it offensive? Yes. Is it racist? Yes. Okay? Is it whatever? Yes. But the question is, does it present a clear and present danger to the safety of the people in a community? Now, you can debate this because, for example, racist speech has been tolerated in this country for decades. People say racist things all the time, and their speech is not curtailed. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. You have to think about the law as far as I can understand it, and what presents a clear and present danger, however offensive, however anti-democratic the views may be. I think the other thing is there are so many ways to protest a speaker that do not involve violence. For example, you can come in and hold up a sign. You can come in and turn your back on the speaker. You can come in and walk out en masse. There are many nonviolent tactics that can be used to oppose these views. You can also leaflet and take the text of what somebody is saying and oppose it. But I think the use of violence trying to shut down speakers is a mistake. And I think it was very unfortunate that this happened in Berkeley. I remember it very, very clearly. I was opposed to it at the time. And I don't think it's an effective way of dealing. You also then alienate a lot of students who are afraid to come out because they don't want to get hurt. And so I think you can always use other more creative tactics to oppose such speech.
Amen. And it's about respect. The whole notion of the free speech movement was this is a place to exchange ideas. We happen to like our ideas better than some other ideas. And if we like them enough, we have confidence in them so that other ideas can be heard and higher ideas can be heard alongside and weighed, and we'll come out ahead. But if we're saying, no, those are wrong ideas, so you got to shut up, deplatform them, shut down their meeting, disrupt it with hecklers, disrupt it by breaking the windows and lighting things, what does that do? That shows total disrespect for the people to whom that speech is given to be able to evaluate it and say, that guy's full of crap. I don't need you to tell me that. I just heard it. He's full of crap. By going in there and trying to violently break it up, that was, when you say Berkeley activists, I think it's important to remember there were many hundred, maybe 1,000 students outside Yiannopoulos peacefully protesting, and 40 people organized with things to throw. They had bags full of bricks and stuff and Molotov cocktails. We don't know who they were. Were they opposed to Yiannopoulos? Maybe. Maybe there are people who get too crazy and want to do that kind of stuff. But they also could have been on the same side setting up a photo op for Fox, because it worked brilliantly. You do not want that mistaken for you. So if you try and deny someone a platform, we know who has the power to deny platforms. We can do a little of it, and if that's the principle, the other side will do far more, and we will lose out. We will not be able to express our opinions. We can't let them have theirs. We sure as hell are not going to get to do ours. Have some confidence, calm down, and take them on the level of ideas, and win.
I just want to say, just in terms of the effectiveness, what you do is you change the conversation from the validity of your ideas to the tactic you used. So people are no longer discussing, the question of Israel versus Palestine, or the question of civil rights, or whatever the question of the day is. They're discussing whether you should have blocked the highway so people couldn't get home, whether you should have blocked the bridge so ambulances couldn't go by, whether you should have allowed the people to speak. It's stupid to keep changing the topic away from the one you really want to have discussed and change people's minds about. So that's my thought.
Thank you all so much. So we just have time for one more question before we move to audience Q&A. And this question is also open to anyone that would like to answer. Throughout our conversation today, we've seen that clearly the FSM and activism in general holds incredible personal significance throughout your lives, not just as a student, but also through the rest of your lives. How has being a part of a massive student movement impacted your experience of life?
Well, I'll just say I taught it. I taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz for 40 years, more than 40 years. And my introduction to feminisms class was really an exercise in political thinking. I never imposed views on the students, but I used my experience as a political activist in order to encourage students to empower themselves, and in particular, of course, women. In the women's liberation movement. That was the sort of the start of women's studies and where I started teaching. And this course on feminism and social justice that I've taught online that you mentioned in the introduction, so it's done through the Mass Online Learning Program that's at the University of California, and it's on the Coursera platform, which is a global platform. And I was very resistant to teaching this class on feminism and social justice, but the whole class, online. I taught it in person at the university for about 10 years. And it's all about social justice movements and the role that women played in those social justice movements and the role of how those social justice movements worked and didn't work and what was involved in them, starting in the 1950s in the United States. So that was the point of the class. So they finally convinced me to do it online. You know, I'm an old fogey. I thought you had to teach in person and not teach online. But I did 4 lectures, which is what they told me to do. And as of Monday, that's yesterday, we had 121,123 or something students that have taken this class. They are all over the world. They are literally every continent. And I have corresponded with them on email, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. And I have Zoomed with them, with women in Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, Tehran. I did a whole podcast on women's history with a student in Tehran. So the technology has been incredible, and it's been inspiring for me. And I just want to say, I would never. I mean, the free speech movement was in my blood. You know what I mean? That's who I am. And so that's how I've taught. And again, without insisting that anybody agree with me, I always tell the students, you can disagree with me, just engage, just critically think, just engage. And so teaching that, that's what I would say. And it's still running on Coursera, you can still access it, Feminism and Social Justice. I had no idea this was going to happen. It was the most extraordinary experience. And what beautiful global feminist movements are going on. Let me tell you, the world is afire with them. In all these different continents and all these different experiences and all the struggles that women are engaged in, especially against violence and especially for education. Thank you.
Well, this is a funny time of the year to respond to this, because my feeling at this moment is probably more pessimistic and negative about the world and where it's going than at any time in my life, and about the country too. But that being said, until very recently, I think the effect on my life was twofold. First of all, it made me maintain an optimism about what you could accomplish if you tried against large forces. So that we were, came out of the, oh, you want to see that happen? Well, go ahead and do it, or try to organize it, or join a group that's already trying to do it. But it was like, we will win. And we had so many things that we won, And Robbie was one of the people at the encampment for the anti-apartheid encampment that took place in Berkeley. The anti-apartheid forces won, okay? The gay rights movement. When I was growing up, when I was 19, you never heard a word about that. It was all sneaky, the Mattachine Society and stuff, little pamphlets that were snuck by people. That has changed amazingly, as well as, of course, the women's movement, which doesn't mean there aren't, places we still have to go and barriers that still have to be broken. But it made it made me very optimistic about, participating in political activity. And The other thing that did, which has changed mind-bogglingly, is we came out of the FSM and the civil rights movement and so forth, and people started writing articles about, well, how do you stay a progressive or a political activist or whatever throughout your life? What work can you do? Where, how can you live? And so I came out convinced you never take a job just for the money. You take a job because you believe in what you're doing and you do no harm. Whatever you do no harm. And so, I wound up teaching for a while. I wound up doing labor organizing with welfare workers, and wound up finally being a librarian. Okay, so 2 notes on this. Being a librarian, I felt I was able to reach kids and give them the right book at the right time. And I thought it was a beautiful job. I loved it. I was a children's librarian. Okay. I've been so proud of the opposition that librarians have showed to the moves about censorship in this country. I said, what a great profession. All these fantastic librarians. Okay. Before you do that, I just want to tell you that Robbie organized a couple of events at NYU in honor of this commemoration. And one of them was to be held at the library. But then it turned out that the head librarian, who was a graduate of Berkeley Library School, perish the thought, found out that he wasn't just going to talk about the events and the speakers were not just going to talk about the events of 1964, they were going to talk about current things like the sit-ins at NYU that had been disrupted. And she shut the whole thing down. She said, you can't talk about that. She left it out of the publicity, and then she banned them completely from the library. So his department in the School of Ed took over the lecture. But I thought, oh my God, fire that librarian. Who is she? So anyway, it's a great profession and a great place to make a stand. That's it.
Well, I always say I only went to college long enough to get arrested, which is true. I only took actually 3 classes at Berkeley. I was signed up for 5 during the free speech movement. In one way or another, dropped 4. Well, it was all right. I got an outstanding education, all taught by masters in the field, all labs, in the plaza, at the Oakland jail, at Santa Rita, in endless meetings where I learned everything about organization. I learned of the practical tools and all the tasks I did, from leafleting to carrying around the loudspeakers to everything else we did. I learned solidarity and how it works and how important it is. I learned the tensions between leadership and a mass movement, and there are such tensions, and we managed them with some difficulty, but we did. And I learned by participating in it. I was lucky enough, sheer luck, my life has been that story. I got elected to XCOM. I was the youngest member, so I got to sit in all the meetings and listen to how these ideas were thrown out, and we made up our minds what to do, and were effective at doing it. What an education! I'm sure they don't offer this course here anymore. But from there, what was I going to do? What do you do with 2 F's and 2 incompletes and a B? Okay, and I very much related to David Goines, one of our leaders, who said in his book that after he got thrown out of Cal, he suddenly realized he had a headache for 12 years. And it was called school. So what to do? Well, it was obvious what to do. The reason I went to Cal, what I would learn, was how to change the country, do something about racism, and here came the Vietnam War. Well, okay, I know what to do now. And I spent the next 7 years or so doing that, refused induction, and I finally kind of slowed down my political activity by the time I got married and started to have kids and realized, oh, I'm gonna have to feed them. But next thing I know, I'm a school activist. I'm down volunteering, and I'm at every school board meeting demanding that cuts be stopped. And there are other things going on, and when I hear, the fire bell, I'm an old fire horse, I get in the harness and start running, where are we going? What's up, where's the call? But it's just what you do with your life. It's the most satisfying. Right now, I am, as of this summer, I am a member of the Eugene, Oregon Police Commission. Because I've been an activist around police reform for 25 years, and I've gotten to know the police department quite well, and they me, and discovered, much to my shock, that there were as many of them in favor of reform as I was. And it was just, what? I was gobsmacked. I learned something new. I have agitated at the U.S. Air Force Academy, or the Command and Staff School of the U.S. Air Force, before a room full of colonels. It's just, what else would I do? I mean, what do you do? You're a person, you're a human being, you live on the planet, there's stuff going on, you want it all decided by Elon Musk? I don't think so. And I learned how you go about changing it. You can't necessarily get what you want, but you certainly know how to go about trying, and you certainly know how to make something. We felt that we had put our hands and shoulders to the levers of history and felt it move. And that's the feeling you never lose. You can't get over that. And all I would like to see coming out of this forum and everything else that goes on is that 60 years from now, of course I won't see it, but 60 years from now, people are getting together in this room to talk about what people of this generation and you students did. Go get it.
I have to say, it's horrific to me to see that 60% of Harvard students, for example, want to, I'm just throwing a number out, I don't know what the exact number was, but want to become stockbrokers and consultants at McKinsey or whatever like that. What kind of ambition is that to have when you're 20 years old? Think big, guys, think big.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. Give a big round of applause for our speakers. Okay. So in the interest of time, we'll move right into our audience Q&A. And here's what we're going to do. So if you have a question for our speakers, please form a line down the center aisle. And we have a forum member at the top of the aisle with a mic that will have you ask your question. And we would also like to ask if there are any students in the room that would like to ask a question, please let them to the front of the line. Prioritize the students, please. Yeah, could we get a mic?
Let the students to the front of the line, please.
That means you, David Cooper. You're not a student currently.
Come on.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. This is a beautiful speech. I want to mention my name is Aidan Hill. I'm a People's Park activist. I've been active in Berkeley running for city council. I actually stood on this stage when the previous chancellor was here, stepped on a chair, and said, "People over profit." My question for you, noting how much UC Berkeley has attempted to destroy not only the history of People's Park, but the basic ecology, the basic ability for communities to stay together. I'm curious how you feel the free speech movement led to People's Park, and ultimately how us in this position can win that fight against government expansion and corporate influence.
When I drove up today, I was driving up Telegraph and I saw the big construction going on where People's Park had been. People had told me about it, but I actually saw it. So there was a vision that I remember in the 60s, the late 60s, for a certain kind of community. And People's Park was emblematic of that. And it had to do with building community, like what you're saying, but it was also emblematic of something else, which is that the university, I think, especially the Regents, had in mind a certain kind of corporate boutique vision of what they wanted Telegraph Avenue to look like, and to be and sort of as the entrance to the university. And it was very antithetical to the kind of street culture that existed on Telegraph Avenue at that time. And I think People's Park was emblematic of that. I want to say there were a lot of People's Parks. I didn't know that, but I heard a paper at a conference a couple of years ago where there were a lot of People's Parks in different communities around this country, most of which were destroyed or attacked in various ways. And I think it represented an effort to build a certain kind of community that was as harmonious as possible and honored children, that took care of the environment, and that nurtured rather than destroyed communities. And I think, and so I think it's very tragic what has taken place in terms of People's Park, but I'm not surprised by it. And the other thing I wanted to say in terms of this building of community is that Black communities, as I'm sure you are aware, have been urban renewed to death across this country with building of freeways and building of various other, and I learned recently, for example, that there was a thriving multiracial, mostly Black community where Lincoln Center is now in New York for the opera and that whole cultural thing. And I also learned recently that there was a thriving Native American community of the Seneca people in what is now Central Park. So there's a long history in this country of destroying these kinds of communities that are also can become centers of a different kind of consciousness and resistance. So that's how I would respond to your question. And thank you for your work. Thank you for your work.
Thank you. Was there any other response from you? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I learned a lot. It was great talk. There's a couple comments and a question. You know, Hillary Clinton has just called for Americans engaged in speech she calls misinformation to be civilly or criminally charged. John Kerry just indicated the First Amendment is a major barrier for the powerful elite to control the so-called facts. Robert Reich has called for the arrest of Elon Musk for allowing unfettered free speech on his platform X. And these people all remain champions of the left of the Democratic Party to date, and they have all called for, no uncertain language, the evisceration of our First Amendment. Just in the last couple of weeks, that all took place, right? Other things that were once misinformation include the sun revolving around the earth, smoking being healthy, Oxycontin being non-addictive, and many, many other things. So I guess my question to you, if you have a response to that, but also, you know, who is going to be the arbiter of this, and malinformation, and how do we here that we value First Amendment freedom of speech align politically with a group that really continues to cherish free speech, the First Amendment, understand that's the value, the origin of all of our human freedom comes from our ability to think, talk, and act. So just comments and questions after that.
It's a complicated issue, and I don't think there's a real simple answer one way or the other, because what you get is not only people speaking far removed from fact, but people doing so on a platform of $1 billion, giving you pretty wide speech. I can go out on the corner and say things which are true or not true, and maybe 100 people will hear me. But I can't go online and reach millions and millions and millions of people with absolute nonsense. We have seen how, starting I think with Murdoch to some extent, it has gotten so that everybody's got their own facts, and there is no commonly agreed on reality, and it is crippling our ability to deal with problems that are threatening us today. Now, who then decides what's reality? That's one I do not have an answer for, but I do know who I would like not to be the arbiter, and the first one would be the wealthy. That would be where I would start and where my most concern is. I do have concern about the possibilities of government intervention on the question of free speech. That's where we start. That's what we are for and about. So we don't want to see that happen from the government, but the government is the only power in this country that we have any power over in elections. The wealthy we have no power whatsoever over, and they have the other main power, that is the ability to speak. And I sure as hell don't want to see it. We're not going to have a debate now. We just asked for our answers. So, but I do not have a real good answer to your question.
You did say earlier, though, we need to be able to have a forum for ideas of all kinds.
We certainly do.
Present,
and that's a forum for ideas of all kinds. Does not mean Mr. Murdoch or Mr. Musk or whoever has a platform for their ideas, and
just know,
we can't be
just
there.
know, just
Okay.
know, this man is silencing me. Just know, he's talking over. Just know this. Everyone knows this, and so thank you very much. Bye-bye. That's awesome. That's fantastic.
Folks, take it easy. It's okay.
Hi, I have a question here. I just wanted to say thank you for coming and speaking. It was an honor to hear from you guys. It was an honor to hear from you guys. I wanted to ask a question about whether you think the same principles of free speech that we shouldn't be deciding whether or who students can and can't hear from or can and can't say, whether that also applies to the digital world when it comes to social media companies. Obviously, with social media, the things we say spread quicker and reach many more ears. And I specifically wanted to point to the case of the January 6th riots, where after former President Trump's social media accounts all got suspended because of the risk of further incitement, and whether you guys agree with that decision of suspending it because of that risk, or whether they should have been allowed to stay up and let people on social media decide for themselves what to do with the things he says, despite that risk, and given that the way that his words hold more weight because he's the president, and just what your thoughts are on that decision.
So I'll start, and it's your question is related to the points that the other participant was making. Social media adds a whole new dimension to the issue of freedom of speech, which we haven't really figured out. I think we should just acknowledge that, because on social media, people can say anything they want. And then, of course, as Jack just pointed out, you have people on social media like Elon Musk who have billions of dollars, who control huge networks. You also have a population which is miseducated or largely uneducated. This is another huge problem because of sustained attacks on public education in this country, and the racialization, the racism that has, in my opinion, has gripped the educational system in this country. So these are all intertwined. It's not like you can isolate these various problems because they're all intertwined. For example, you could have this former President Trump talk about Haitian people in ways that was appalling, just simply appalling, to the point that the Haitian people themselves in Springfield, Illinois, filed lawsuit against him. Now, if you take the standard that I was explaining before about a clear and present danger, it was a clear and present danger to the safety of the Haitian people in that community, which the city itself acknowledged, and that should have allowed for that content to be countered and excised. You see what in other words, if you use that standard, yes, say January 6th, for example, if you hold the position that January 6th was a counter-revolution or was an insurrection, the Constitution provides for the suppression of insurrection. It doesn't allow for it. So then you get into the debate of, was it an insurrection, you see, and to what extent it was, and so on. So again, did his speech, which incited the mob to attack the Congress of the United States, constitute a clear and present danger to democracy and to the lives and safety of the people inside Congress? And you could argue that it did, right? Quite seriously. So I think, but I'm not saying these are solutions. I'm saying there is a standard, and we have to think about how that standard can be applied. And that doesn't have to do with the government suppressing speech, or you see the distinction I'm trying to make. But I always tend to go back toward mass education, toward reaching people door to door, toward talking to people face to face about what they're hearing and what they're thinking and why they're thinking it, and how can I give you another point of view that might be also persuasive and helpful. We don't have, I don't think anybody has a solution to this problem of social media right now. But I think it is tied in, like I said, with a whole bunch of other issues and a lack of education and critical thinking.
Mario said something at the rally we held to celebrate our victory.
Yes.
And he said, now that we have free speech, we have to be responsible in how we use it. This is not just a license to get up and say anything. It is to use that speech thoughtfully, effectively, responsibly.
Yeah, unfortunately, people don't. I mean, you can't rely on people to be thoughtful and responsible and so forth.
But you can model that.
You can model it. It's just a very tricky question. The question of censorship on social media, on X, on whatever. And I don't have an answer. But it's very difficult, and there's no black and white issue. I mean, it's all a mess.
Just to let everyone know, we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. I, in brief, would love your response to this following question. A question coming to you both from a UC grad, a former UC instructor, resident, and employee of UC. And my parents met at UC, and my grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, and my other grandparents founded Camp Tawonga 100 years ago and directed the San Francisco Jewish Community Center. My question is, what is your view of the Israeli academic cartel taking a stranglehold to free speech on campuses across this country, causing trouble and violence upon undergrads and trouble for professors and administrators this past year? In brief, please.
We hate it.
I thought Bettina pretty much discussed that.
Yeah, I tried, David, to address that earlier when I talked about the encampments and the stranglehold of it's AIPAC, it's the very, very, very conservative wing of the Jewish community. And they happen to have a lot of money, and they intimidate and so on. So I guess that's what I would, yeah, communist. And I will just say, I know myself, other people involved in Jewish Voice for Peace, and other organizations are doing our best to try to strengthen the more progressive wing of the Jewish community, which has deep roots in Judaism, including the concept in Hebrew, it's tikkun olam, to heal the world. And, my parents were Jewish and communists. And there were a lot of Jews who were socialists. And we have a long history of Jewish radical tradition. And it's very unfortunate to see the rise in this kind of stranglehold. And I just want to say one other thing because it so irks me. Do you remember when the president of Harvard, and I'm not remembering her name, the African-American woman who was the president of Harvard, was testifying before Congress? And she was asked about what was clearly an anti-Semitic comment. And she was asked whether or not she would ban that on her campus.
But it's a violation of Harvard regulations.
Yes, and she said, it depends, which is what the lawyers had told her to say. Why does it depend? It depends on whether or not that speech was presenting a clear and present danger. Not whether it was anti-Semitic, of course it was. But it wasn't a question of whether or not it was unpleasant to hear. It wasn't about that. And of course they mounted this huge campaign. These are the people that David is talking about to have her fired, which I considered a terrible travesty, just a travesty. And they went after the other college presidents also. And it really was a violation of the principles of freedom of speech. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to speak to something and to pose something that Dr. Cohen actually posed in his introduction. And that's the moral weight that the free speech movement had behind it. In particular, at the time, the Black liberation struggle and the struggle against the war in Vietnam. And to pose that with what it has to do with the struggle against injustice today. Obviously, I'm not a veteran of the free speech movement, but this Friday at Revolution Books at 6 o'clock, I'll be speaking on the 60th anniversary of the free speech movement, on the lessons that can be extracted from the free speech movement, as well as what it has to do with the struggle against injustice today. And that's going to be with Waldo Martin, a professor and author of Black Against Empire, this Friday at 6 o'clock. But part of what I want to bring to life to people is the experience and the perspective of a veteran of the free speech movement, and he's Bob Avakian. He's one of the students that stood on top of the police car in 1964, and there's a perspective here that's very important that I wanted to actually highlight for people and give people.
Do you have a question?
No, I want your reaction and everyone's reaction on this topic. In the spirit of the free speech movement and the contestation of ideas. In this pamphlet that everyone got here, Bob Avakian says, through all this, the whole rich process of the free speech movement and the larger movement, which it was an important part of, there was an essential thrust of fighting against injustices that are bound up with the basic institutions and structures and social relations in U.S. society. And he poses here, if in today's world, the things that were fought for by the free speech movement and that found a birth and rebirth in the movement of that period, if they haven't been fully achieved, if in fact the things that you were fighting against were in some ways even more pronounced and entrenched, that's not a sign that the movement of that time and since has accomplished nothing of significance. Still less is it a sign that the movement at that time, especially in its most radical, revolutionary development, went too far. Without doubt, the FSM was a high point, but it was also a beginning, and the unity it embodied was also full of contradiction, out of which new struggle was bound to emerge, or things could not have moved forward. The notion that after the free speech movement and everything it represented became more radical, things degenerated or went downhill as a misreading or a rewriting of the problem. But the question is, if things have not gotten any better, if things have not gotten any worse, or if things have actually gotten worse, then doesn't that mean that we should actually continue this struggle? Doesn't that mean we should deepen this struggle? And once again, I invite everyone into this process of discovery to come to Revolution Books this Friday at 6 o'clock.
Thank you. This is a very useful example of one of the reasons the movement movement diminished to a certain point. And I refer to it as predator politics. We did not have this in the free speech movement. We had a dozen or more, 15, 16 different political tendencies, all very different, and not one of them ever tried to take on the free speech movement as its own personal advertisement, or to push the interests of its particular group ahead of any other, to get its people on the platform, to get its name up there next to the organization. And you asked for my opinion, so I'm offering it to you. If you wish to shout while I'm speaking, I heard you. You read us a long passage. Thank you very much. Okay? And I think you gave us an excellent example. It's not your organization particularly, but any organization that tries to use a mass movement or a historic event as its own advertisement is trying to sell you something, and most people ain't buying it. For a good reason. Thank you very much.
That's what we're inviting people to do, to get into the content of the free speech movement.
Can I respond a little bit? Yeah, so let me just say, one of the tendencies of the Communist Party, which I was a member for 19 years, which I didn't agree with, was to try to establish hegemony over the movement. It tried to do that during the anti-war movement, and it wasn't alone in that. The socialists, what was then the Trotskyite wing of the socialist movement, also tried to do that. And what we accomplished, that is to say, what happened was that those people that desperately wanted to end the war, that was why they were involved in the movement, could not understand the infighting that was going on in the organizational meetings of which I was a part. It hurt the movement. I also want to say that, yes, this country is very, very, very badly divided now. You're right about that. There's a right-wing fascist movement in this country that has taken hold in a certain kind of populism mostly represented by Trump, in terms of what he's been able to galvanize. But the roots of that have been in the history of this country forever. And they're rooted in slavery, and they're rooted in imperialism and colonialism, and those issues are all intertwined with each other. And that doesn't take away from the fact that there have also been powerful victories. And that the labor movement right now, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the labor movement right now is organizing like crazy.
As we're sitting on the brink of nuclear war and climate catastrophe.
Yes,
We know that.
and
We're
we're
all
all,
living here.
aware of
We
that.
know what it is.
And we're also aware of the struggles that are taking place. So it would seem to me that the main thing we need to do right now is to unite as many people as we can in whatever area is most, and they're all very pressing, but the organization of young workers is very, very important right now. They have tremendous potential in terms of power, and you know this as a Marxist. And the other areas in terms of ending this dreadful, horrific Israeli aggression in Palestine and Lebanon has got to stop. This is not they're not defending themselves anymore, and they haven't been for quite some time. And so that's very urgent. And I might also add the Russians in Ukraine, who we haven't mentioned yet tonight, but the Ukrainian people are suffering. There's a terrible catastrophe in Sudan right now, in which thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, are on the brink of starvation over a civil war that has to do with resources and climate conditions, and they're all intertwined with each other. If people want to go to the Friday night event, I recommend go and listen and participate, or not. But there's no reason for us to in any way be divided here. We're all on the same page. We're all part of a progressive, and sometimes revolutionary, sometimes democratic, but they're always democratic movement for guaranteeing freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, encapsulated in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Thank you.
Lord, lead me not into temptation.
We have one more song we were going to do for you to conclude. Ready?
When we put forward the proposition that we were citizens of the United States and therefore entitled to our rights under the Constitution, the educational leader of the University of California replied that 49% of us were followers of Fidel Castro and Mao Zedong. And so, do you see the word has come? Clark Kerr has told us friends. If you are 49%, you can't work for the government. The knowledge factory turns out more GNP without your subversion on its property. Woo! We used to sing better.
We're done. We
Well,
didn't
we
get it.
always add some humor. You have to have some humor.
Yes, we can't stop now. One of the things about the FSM, which most of you will probably remember, is that we sang a lot, we had a lot of culture, people wrote plays that got put on, and we had a sense of humor. And given what you have to fight, you need to keep that sense of humor, because otherwise, I don't know what otherwise. You gotta believe, but you gotta laugh about it too. So.
Thank you. One last round of applause for our speakers. So, at every forum event, our team likes to make a special speaker poster for our speakers, and tonight is no different. So today's poster was made by Saisha and Nurin, and they'll come up to the stage now to present the posters to our speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll just take a picture real quick.
By the way, we didn't choose the title of this event, so we deny all iconization.